Welcome back, students. This is Module 2.3.4, Aerobic Respiration. We have been talking about what happens during the catabolism of a molecule of glucose. The first thing that happens in the cytoplasm is it is split by the process of glycolysis, producing two pyruvates from 1,6-carbon glucose. The fate of these pyruvates depends upon the oxygen environment in the cell. If there is no oxygen, then the process of fermentation occurs, and that's what you're seeing a summary of on the slide in front of you right now. We are in this module going to speak about the other fork in the road, but before we leave glycolysis and fermentation altogether, I want to just consider its history to some extent, the evolutionary history of the idea. The oldest bacterial fossils are over 3.5 billion years old, and this is before there was a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, and therefore this was before aerobic respiration, that which requires oxygen, was widespread. This suggests that the first bacteria may have generated ATP exclusively by the process of glycolysis. That's an interesting supposition. It turns out that if we look at metabolic pathways in living organisms, that glycolysis is the most widespread, and it occurs without any organelles, also suggesting that it originated in bacteria. And so we know that glycolysis probably was very early. So that's one fork. Remember that little summary diagram you drew? That's very useful. Go back and look at that. And then, of course, we've just considered the right-hand fork. Now, the left-hand fork is what happens if there is oxygen present. If oxygen is present, then aerobic respiration will follow glycolysis instead of fermentation. And this is the aerobic pathway. And so the pyruvate will be transported to the mitochondria. This transport is active transport, so it does require some energy to get the pyruvate into the mitochondria. Aerobic respiration consists of two processes, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. The aerobic pathway, the entire aerobic pathway, would include the precursor of glycolysis and then aerobic respiration, which consists of the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. So we're going to learn about these other steps that can occur if oxygen is present and pyruvate moves to the mitochondria. So the first stage of aerobic respiration occurs only if oxygen is present. That is, there is an aerobic environment, and it occurs in the matrix of the mitochondria. It begins with pyruvate that was actively transported there. You will recall that pyruvate is the product of glycolysis. In the process of the Krebs cycle, pyruvate has a lot of carbon-carbon and carbon-hydrogen bonds, and these are very energy-rich bonds, and those carbon-hydrogen bonds are broken, and the hydrogens are stripped off, and the carbon that is released as carbon dioxide. So this is why when you exhale in your breath, there's a higher concentration of carbon dioxide than when you inhale, because carbon dioxide is a waste from the Krebs cycle. Now, all the energy that is harvested in the Krebs cycle, not that much of it is released directly as ATP. It does directly produce 2 ATPs, but it also charges many energy carriers. So much of the energy is stored for use in a later process. And that's basically what happens in the Krebs cycle. It is followed by the electron transport chain. So the electron transport chain is the second and final stage of aerobic respiration. It occurs across the inner membranes of the mitochondria. Remember that the Krebs cycle occurred in the matrix, the inner compartment. The electrons from the charged energy carriers, they were charged from the Krebs cycle. These electrons are stripped off and they're transported down proteins that are embedded in the inner membrane. And it's in a very efficient way where the correct proteins are in the correct order and they are passed down. And as this flow of electrons occurs, this energy is used to pump hydrogen ions from the inside compartment to the outside compartment. And this actually puts them in a position where they're highly concentrated, giving them great potential energy. This is like putting water behind a dam. It has energy, potential energy, by virtue of the position. And as those hydrogen ions, which have been pumped to the outer compartment, flow back into the inner compartment, they flow across the membrane through a special protein. This protein is kind of like a pump, and as the hydrogen ions flow through it, they catalyze, this protein catalyzes, causes the formation of ATP. So ADP plus P goes to ATP as these hydrogen ions flow back across. And this occurs many times. This produces 32 ATPs. And the process of the electrons flowing down and the hydrogen ions being pumped across and then flowing back and creating ATP, this is called chemiosmosis. I guess I need to catch up here on the slide. So chemiosmosis is the process. And we're going to review this on a diagram, hopefully to help drive it home to you a little bit and make sure that you understand it. So 32 more ATP are produced beyond the 2 from glycolysis and the 2 from Krebs cycle. And so in the aerobic pathway, there's a total of 36 ATPs produced per glucose. And that is a lot. Now, what is very interesting is that this process can only occur if there is a particular chemical there at the end, and that chemical is oxygen. Oxygen serves as the final electron acceptor. As the electrons flow down through those proteins, it is oxygen at the end that accepts them, and those electrons with hydrogens will create water. So the oxygen plus the hydrogen and the electrons produce water. And if there is no oxygen there, it backs up the whole process. That can't come down the proteins, it can't be pumped across, can't make ATP, backs up all the way through the Krebs cycle. And so without oxygen, we have an anaerobic environment. The aerobic pathway is unavailable. And the pyruvate, rather than being actively pumped into the mitochondria, remains in the cytoplasm and undergoes the process of fermentation. And so the anaerobic pathway is used in the absence of oxygen. Let's look at a diagram of chemiosmosis in the electron transport chain. This diagram, which if you get really close to your computer screen, you can almost read the captions, but that's not critical. You can locate yourself here. The red dot is the Krebs cycle. That's the matrix or the inner compartment of the mitochondrion. This structure here, the lighter color with the embedded purple blobs, those purple blobs are the proteins, and these are the proteins that are involved in the electron transport chain. And as the high energy carriers from the Krebs cycle come over to these proteins, the electrons are stripped off and they flow down. And electron flow is in fact a source of energy. Electricity is a flow of electrons. And so as it flows down, this energy is used to pump hydrogen ions from the inner compartment to the outer compartment. So out here in the outer compartment, we can see a high concentration of hydrogen ions. And this is what I said was like water behind a dam. And it flows back through, the hydrogen ions flow back through a special protein, and this protein creates ATP down here. And at the end of the electron transport chain, we have oxygen sitting there like a catcher with a catcher's mitt, catching those electrons and forming water. So it's a critical role, and oxygen, we call it the final electron acceptor. And those are important words that you need to use when you're describing this process on an examination. So oxygen is the final electron acceptor, and it allows the aerobic pathway to proceed. We can look at the summary equation for the aerobic pathway for aerobic cellular respiration. And this, of course, summarizes many reactions, the reactions of glycolysis, the reactions of the Krebs cycle, the reactions of the electron transport chain are all summarized in a single equation. And there it is. You should be able to produce a similar equation. Glucose plus oxygen produces carbon dioxide and water. And notice that we start with the larger molecule glucose, and it's broken into a smaller molecule, and it produces energy. And this is, of course, what allows life to continue. From one molecule of glucose, we get 36 ATPs, and remember, we need millions and millions per second. So this happens over and over again in all the mitochondria of the cells. Typically in a summary equation, we might not include ADP plus ATP here. I'm just putting it here to really show you that the energy is produced. And this will conclude this module.